It's been a topic for discussion for a very long time. What is canon in Dragon Ball? So in this video we'll discuss exactly that. Right off the bat, I just want to say that something being official does not make it canon. There is a lot of non-canon content that is official. What's canon is much more complex than licensing. It doesn't help that the term canon is actually very loose and there are many different ways to interpret it and to say what is canonical. In short, it would be pointless to debate the semantics behind the term. Lucky for us, we actually are taught exactly what qualifies as canon in the Dragon Ball universe. In a 2020 interview for Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, the lead developer Ryusuke Hara defined canon as something created by Toriyama himself. He further goes on to say that the bits created by the development team are not canon, thus making it clear that for something to be canon, it needs to be written specifically by Toriyama. In another interview, he adds that Bonio's story is part of the official story of the franchise because it was written by Toriyama and had no input from the development team. This implies that if the development team added anything to the sub-stories that Toriyama wrote, then they wouldn't be canon. This interview also obviously confirms that not everything in Dragon Ball Z Kakarot is canon, with them noting that the bits that were created or have had any modification from the development team are not canon. Dragon Ball's official website also notes that the events of Dragon Ball Xenoverse are not possible to occur in canon, suggesting that Xenoverse isn't canon. This in turn also makes Heroes non-canon because Heroes and Xenoverse share continuity and the events of Xenoverse have happened in Heroes, which again are impossible to happen in canon. So already we have a ton of non-canon content. So what is canon? Obviously we have the original manga since it's written directly by Toriyama. The Dragon Ball Super manga is written and supervised by Toriyama and it's also stated to be the canonical sequel to Dragon Ball. This would also imply that the Super Anime and GT are not canon sequels. In fact, both GT and Super don't qualify for our established definition for what's canon. While Toriyama had minor involvement with GT such as character design, GT was written by Toei Animation. And while Toriyama does indeed provide Super with a rough draft, Toei very clearly makes a lot of changes and develops the story in a different way, as evident by just how different the anime and the manga are, as well as all the arcs and episodes that are exclusive to the anime. The Dragon Ball Z anime would also not be canon since the Z anime has extra input from Toei Animation, often extending and outright changing the original manga and even including many fewer storylines not present in the manga and not written by Toriyama. And while Dragon Ball Kai does try to cut some of that filler out and stay more true to the manga, it still includes some filler and it still contains statements and events that are added by Toei and contradict the manga. As for the movies, none of them until Battle of Gods would be canon since they are written by Toei, with him only having minor involvement such as doing character designs and even noting that he's nothing more than an audience member to the movies. However, Toriyama has written the scripts for Battle of Gods, Resurrection F, Broly and Super Hero, thus making those movies what would be considered canonical, especially Resurrection F, which is stated to be part of the Dragon Ball Super manga's continuity. While Battle of Gods, Broly and Super Hero were originally meant to be canon to the manga, this got retconned with the manga adapting the movies differently and making a lot of changes to them. Thus, while upon release they were definitely canonical, they are no longer such and have been since retconned. As for OVAs, the only canonical OVA would be the 2008 special, which Toriyama had written. The other OVAs, however, are not written by Toriyama, and in fact Toriyama himself noted how vastly different Toei's OVAs are from what he writes. As for video games, most of them would be 100% non-canon since their story modes are not written by Toriyama and they alter the story and develop it differently. However, Kakarot does include some canonical content such as Bongo's story since it was written by Toriyama and had no input from the development team. Dragon Ball Online can also be considered somewhat canon, with Toriyama being involved with writing its story, although to what extent it's canon is up to debate. This is because Kakarot makes it very clear that parts of the story can be canon while other parts can be non-canon, so we know that the game can contain both canon and non-canon content. In short, the only things that are canonical from Dragon Ball Online are the things we can verify are written directly by Toriyama and had no input from the development team. Dragon Ball Daima status, however, is more debatable since Toriyama undoubtedly had a lot of involvement with it. However, in an interview, Toriyama actually confirmed that the story of Daima was already planned out even before he got involved, which would suggest that while Toriyama did have involvement and wrote a bunch of stuff, the overall story and plot were a product of Toei, and thus he would not be the sole writer and possibly only wrote small portions of the story. Thus, Daima would be non-canon. In fact, Daima heavily contradicts the Super manga and Toriyama's interviews on many instances, so it's by all means non-canon. So with all of that said, what's canon in Dragon Ball is the manga, along with the 2008 special Resurrection F, bits of Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, and bits of Dragon Ball Online, with virtually nothing else being canon. Virtually nothing else is ever stated to be canonical, and virtually nothing else fits for the definition for what's described as canon to Dragon Ball. Now I would like to counter some bad faith arguments people make. Most recently there is the argument that Toyotaro claimed that since he loves all of Dragon Ball, to him everything is canon, except he literally follows up by saying that it's not his place to determine what's canon, and that he has no authority on on the matter, so anything he states would be his personal bias outside of his authority in Dragon Ball. People try to cope by saying he's just being humble, however that's just them making things up. He's outright saying he can't determine what's canon, so listen to him. I can also argue that him saying that he lost all of Dragon Ball and thus everything will be canon to him is him being humble since he doesn't want to insult the franchise. Another argument often brought up is Toriyama stating that Dragon Ball is both an anime and a manga, so he would be happy if we watch both. There are two main issues here, starting with the fact that this is a blatant mistranslation. The official translation doesn't say anything of the sort. And even if it wasn't a mistranslation, nor is canonicity suggested anywhere here, nor is it the context of his statement. Yes, Dragon Ball is a multimedia franchise that has both an anime and a manga, and yes, he would be happy if you watched both. However, that doesn't make the anime canon. This is just a bad interpretation that adds context that isn't present in Toriyama's words. I've also seen this fake quote for a site called Pojo, however, not only is there no source, there's making it very questionable and invalid, but it's also being stated to be faked by Vegito-EX, who is essentially one of the most knowledgeable people in the Dragon Ball fandom and a head moderator at Kanzenshu. Another argument I've seen thrown around are examples like Pizza and Turibo appearing as cameos in the Dragon Ball Super manga, thus the anime should be canon. The issue with this is that just because the manga chose to take a few elements from the anime and try them into the manga doesn't mean that the anime as a whole is canon. From all intent and purposes, these characters can be different people with a different story and origins from what's shown in the anime. You can canonize the general concept of a character without canonizing the entire original story featuring them. Prime examples to this are Brog and Pargas, whose characters were canonized in Super, but their story and origins have been completely altered, thus not making the Z movies canon. So I'll say the general concept of a character named Turibu may be canon. That doesn't mean that the anime figure where we see him fight Pycon is canon. This is actually very evident with Pizza, since in the anime she appears with Mr. Satan to fight Cell, while in the manga she didn't and was not present during the Cell games, thus showing us that while a character with her name and design was canonized, her story from the anime was not canonized. I've also seen the argument that the DBS manga is just an adaptation of the anime and thus the anime is the canonical sequel to Dragon Ball. However, that's contradicted by both Shueisha and the definition for what's canon in Dragon Ball, and the anime also contradicts the manga on many instances. It's also very stupid to say the manga is an adaptation of the anime, considering the fact that the manga came out first and is based on Toriyama's script and not Toei's script. It's also not what the magazine says at all to begin with. It's saying that the title is going to receive a manga adaptation, not the anime. The title here more likely refers to the IP itself, since Dragon Ball Super is a title that isn't exclusive to an anime. For example, Dragon Ball as a title encompasses both a manga, an anime, and more. Final argument I've seen is that the Dragon Ball movies refer to as stories in alternate dimensions from the original comics. However, that doesn't entail that they're canon. Those so-called dimensions can simply be non-canon. To begin with, that can be just their way of explaining how the movies aren't meant to be put together with the manga. I've also seen the argument that some Dragon Ball pieces of media refer to as side stories. However, that doesn't make them canon. A side story can be non-canon. There is nothing in the definition of a side story that entails that it has to be canon.